Margaret had always believed that life teaches us our most important lessons when we least expect them. And on this particular Tuesday afternoon, as she stood in her pristine kitchen, wearing her favorite red dress, the one that made her feel confident and purposeful, she had no idea that the universe was about to deliver one of those profound moments that would change everything. The kitchen gleamed with the kind of perfection that comes from years of careful attention. Every surface polished, every appliance spotless, the kind of home that spoke of success and achievement, but also perhaps of loneliness. Margaret had worked so hard to build this life after her divorce 3 years ago, pouring herself into her real estate business, climbing her way to becoming one of the most successful agents in the city. She had been preparing for an important client meeting when she heard it. A soft whimpering sound that seemed to drift through the walls of her carefully controlled world. At first, she thought perhaps it was the neighbor's cat, or maybe the wind through the trees, but as she paused her preparations, the sound came again, more distinctly and unmistakably human. Following the sound, Margaret discovered something that stopped her. A small girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, sitting on her kitchen floor cradling what appeared to be a baby. The child wore a simple pink dress that had seen better days, her dark hair adorned with a small bow that hung slightly askew. Her bare feet were dusty and her eyes wide with fear. The little girl looked up at Margaret with the kind of vulnerability that cuts straight through all pretense, all the walls we build around our hearts. Her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke, those words that would echo in Margaret's mind for years to come. Please don't hurt us in that moment. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition of something she had almost forgotten in her climb toward success. The simple truth that sometimes the most important moments in life have nothing to do with achievement or status, or the carefully constructed image we present to the world. Sometimes they have everything to do with recognizing another human being's need for kindness. Margaret slowly lowered herself to the floor, her elegant red dress pooling around her as she made herself less intimidating to this frightened child. She had no idea how these children had come to be in her home, but in this moment those questions seemed far less important than the immediate need to offer comfort and safety. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Margaret asked, her voice soft and gentle in a way that surprised even herself. The little girl hesitated, her arms tightening protectively around the baby. "Emma," she whispered. "And this is my brother Tommy." "Emma," Margaret repeated, letting the name settle between them. "That's a beautiful name. And you're taking such good care of Tommy." For the first time, a tiny smile flickered across Emma's face, though her eyes remained wary. Margaret noticed the baby bottle lying nearby, apparently dropped in the child's fear, and she carefully picked it up, extending it toward Emma. "Were you feeding Tommy?" she asked. Emma nodded and accepted the bottle with a small thank you that nearly broke Margaret's heart with its politeness despite the circumstances. As Margaret sat there on her kitchen floor, watching Emma tend to her baby brother with the kind of fierce protective love that transcends age, she found herself remembering things she had pushed aside in her busy, successful life. She remembered being young herself, remembered the feeling of being small in a world that seemed too big and sometimes too harsh. The sound of a car door slamming in the driveway startled them both. Emma's eyes went wide with terror and she pulled Tommy closer, whispering something that sounded like a prayer, or maybe just a child's desperate hope that everything would somehow be all right. Heavy footsteps approached the front door, and Margaret could hear the jingle of keys, the sound of someone coming home after what had clearly been a difficult day. She moved protectively closer to Emma, instinctively wanting to shield this child from whatever was causing her such obvious fear. The front door opened and Margaret heard a man's voice calling out, "Emma, Emma, where are you, baby? Daddy's home." But instead of the harsh or angry voice Margaret had expected to hear, there was something else in that call. Something that spoke of worry and exhaustion and love. The voice of a father who was scared for his child. Emma's reaction was immediate and telling. She scrambled to her feet, baby still in her arms, and ran toward the sound of that voice calling, "Daddy, Daddy," in a way that spoke of relief and love, and the kind of trust that only exists between a child and a parent who has never let them down. Margaret rose more slowly, straightening her red dress and following the sound of reunion to her front hallway, where she witnessed something that would stay with her forever. A tall man in a rumpled blue suit was gathering both children into his arms, his relief so palpable it seemed to fill the entire space. His dark hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled as if he had been searching everywhere, and his eyes held the kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical tiredness but from the emotional weight of fear for one's children. The man looked up and saw Margaret standing in the doorway, and she watched as his expression shifted from relief to embarrassment to something that looked almost like shame. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't apologize enough. My daughter, she has a habit of wandering when she's upset, and I've been looking everywhere." Margaret found herself stepping forward, her hand raised in a gesture of understanding rather than dismissal. "Your children are safe," she said, and realized that those simple words carried more weight than any of the complex negotiations she conducted in her business life. The man's name was David, she learned, and the story that unfolded over the next hour was one that reminded Margaret of something she had almost forgotten, that behind every person we meet there is a story more complex and often more heartbreaking than we might imagine. David was indeed wealthy, his success in business evident in his expensive suit, his luxury car parked in Margaret's driveway. But wealth, Margaret learned, did not protect. Against life's most painful challenges, his wife had passed away 8 months ago after a long battle with cancer, leaving him to navigate single parenthood while managing his business and his own grief. Emma had been struggling with the loss of her mother and had developed what David called wandering tendencies, disappearing when the world felt too overwhelming, only to be found in places that somehow represented safety or comfort. Today she had apparently slipped out during David's business meeting with the nanny, distracted by a phone call, as David told his story. Margaret watched Emma, who had settled on the floor again with baby Tommy. The little girl's earlier fear had transformed into something else, a kind of peaceful contentment that suggested she had found what she was looking for in Margaret's pristine kitchen. "It's the strangest thing," David said, his voice filled with wonder. "She's never done anything like this before, just walked into someone's home. But look at her. She's completely calm." Margaret looked at Emma and then at David, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of connection that went beyond the surface interactions of her carefully managed life. There was something about this family, something about the way David's love for his children was so evident in every gesture, every word, that reminded her of what really mattered. "Would you like some tea?" Margaret found herself asking, and was surprised by her own words. She hadn't invited anyone into her home for months, preferring the controlled environment of restaurants or offices for her social and business interactions. David hesitated, clearly aware that he had already imposed enough. But Emma looked up from where she sat with Tommy and said in her small, clear voice, "Daddy, can we stay a little bit?" The lady is nice, and so they stayed. Margaret, finding herself moving through her kitchen with a purpose she hadn't felt in years, preparing tea for David and finding some crackers that Emma could share with Tommy. There was something about having this family in her space that made the house feel different, less like a showcase and more like a home. As they sat together, Margaret found herself sharing things she rarely talked about: her own childhood, her divorce, the way success had sometimes felt like a poor substitute for connection. David listened with the kind of attention that had become rare in her world, and shared his own struggles with balancing work and fatherhood, with managing grief while trying to be strong for his children. Emma, meanwhile, seemed to have appointed herself as Tommy's entertainment director, making faces and sounds that delighted her baby brother, and filled Margaret's usually quiet kitchen with laughter. The sound was foreign and wonderful, and Margaret realized she couldn't remember the last time her home had held such joy. As the afternoon stretched into early evening, David finally acknowledged that they needed to head home. Emma needed dinner and bedtime routines, and he had calls to return. But as they prepared to leave, Margaret found herself reluctant to see them go. Emma walked over to Margaret and took her hand in the way that children do when they want to say something important. "Thank you for not hurting us," she said, and Margaret felt tears she hadn't expected spring to her eyes. "Oh, sweetheart," Margaret said, kneeling down to Emma's level. "I would never hurt you. You're safe here. You're always safe here." David extended his hand to Margaret, his grip firm and warm. Thank you, he said. I don't know what would have happened if Emma had wandered into someone else's home, someone less kind. As Margaret watched them leave David Carr,